How are you? And thanks for tuning into this video. This is 10 mistakes that amateur writers make. Why don't we just get straight down to it? Okay, so mistake number one is, it's an error we all make when we're starting out, and I made it myself. In fact, it actually took me 2 years to write my first novel, and that's because I slogged my way through it. And the reason I slogged my way through it was because I was just coming to it, beginning to work on my novel whenever I could find the time. But, since then, I've detailed a specific time period that I put aside every week or every day now I can afford myself to write. So the number one mistake people make is they don't give themselves enough time to write. Now, I'm not going to go into fine detail on this, but I'm just going to give you a very small tip that will help you. Set out a timetable each week. So you may be able to afford yourself 2 hours to writing each week. You can find a half an hour here and a half an hour there and an hour here, maybe on a Sunday morning or whatever it is. Maybe you can afford even more time to it. But I want you to be consistent with this. So if, for example, your husband is out on a Wednesday evening or your wife is out on a Tuesday evening, I want you to decide soon that Tuesday evening is when you're going to put an hour aside. So whatever it is, I want you to pick apart your week, find out where you can afford an hour or a half an hour throughout your week, and then stick with it week in, week out. So if you decide that every Tuesday, Saturday and Sunday you're going to write, well, then I want you to do that consistently. So you may collate maybe 3 hours or 4 hours or hopefully even a bit more every week that you can give over to your writing. It's very key because this is a fact. 99% of manuscripts go unfinished. And they go unfinished because people find it difficult to find the time. But if you write out a specific timetable for yourself, it will help you. And if you stick to that timetable, trust me, you will write that book. Now, tip number 2 relates to tip number 1, and that is the big mistake that people pants all the way. Now, I've mentioned what pantsing is in an earlier video. Pantsing is flying by the seat of your pants. It's making your story up as you go along. And this, unfortunately, lends itself to the statistic that 99% of manuscripts go unfinished. It's because people aren't planning their manuscript, and when they find the time to write, they find that they're getting bogged down because they don't know where they're going next. And then that manuscript gets put in a drawer, never to be seen again, and becomes part of the statistic, part of the 99%. So, listen, I don't preach that you have to plan meticulously. I don't want you to spend loads of time planning. You don't have to. Some authors do, some don't. Some are pantsers, some are plotters. But when you're a first-time writer, you're an amateur writer, and you're trying to write your first manuscript, it's not wise to pants. It's not wise to just make up your story as you're going along. But I'll give you a very brief tip on this, okay? And I think I've mentioned this to you before. You need to know 2 things when you're starting out to write your manuscript. 1, how your novel begins, and 2, how your novel ends. Because if you know the ending to your novel, it gives you direction. But here's another slight tip. And you can go into this in as much detail as you want, but I would recommend thinking about where your plot's going to go, how it's going to weave, how it's going to get to that ending. And then write down as many bullet points as you can between point A, the beginning, and point B, the ending. So you might have 5 bullet point notes, which, details where your plot is going to go. You may have 20, but each of these bullet points will give you direction, and they will give you motivation to, when you do find that time and you have written down your timetable, of where you're going to go. So it does help you to get to the end, to finally get to the end and finally write that manuscript. So 2 very brief tips are, firstly, write a timetable where you can find time to write, and 2, plot, even just if it's just bullet points, plot where you're going to go, and that's before you even set down to write. Then when you do get writing, we'll move on to mistakes that people make in their writing. Mistake number 3 is writers tell a story. I don't want you to do that. You're going to be a creative writer, so you shouldn't be telling a story. We can all tell a story. I've mentioned this before. We can all sit around the campfire, we can all sit around our friend's house and tell stories to each other. Creative writing is a different art form altogether. So rather than tell, you have to show a story, and you show a story through description, and that's what creative writing is. So rather than saying Tina was crying, you wouldn't write Tina was crying, because that's just a blatant tell. So you may write something like, Tina held the tip of her finger to her nose. It was her attempt to stop the tears from coming from her eyes. Now that is showing that Tina is about to cry, but you're not just telling the reader that Tina is crying. Does that make sense? So you're showing, not telling. And in so many amateur manuscripts that I see, I'm in a fortunate position because I edit professional manuscripts, but I also am a lecturer, so I see so many amateur manuscripts from students, so I can tell the difference between the two. In amateur manuscripts, there's so much telling involved in storytelling, and that's not what we do. That's not what creative writing is. So you have to get yourself out of the habit of telling a story and get yourself into a habit of describing a story, because creative writing is your ability as a writer to paint images inside the mind of a reader. So stop telling a story, start writing a story, start describing a story. Which brings me on to mistake number 4 that amateur writers make, which is they over-describe. Now, you think I'm contradicting myself here, because remember, in mistake number 3, I said don't tell a story. I asked you to describe a story. But now I'm telling you not to over-describe a story. So, there's 2 extremes. One is telling, Tina was crying. And the other extreme is over-describing. So, describing every tear that comes out of her eye, and, her sobbing, and describing everything when all you want to get across is the fact that Tina is crying. So, the beauty or the real skill of creative writing is finding the sweet spot between telling and over-describing. And that is showing your story or painting a picture in your reader's mind. So don't over-describe. So many people, amateur writers, they will have a character enter a room and they'll describe everything in that fucking room, from the painting on the wall to the mirror on that wall, the lamp in the corner, all the different colours, speckles in the carpet. And they describe everything because they think that's what creative writing is. It's not. Description needs to be subtle. They also have this habit of describing exactly how that character looks, what shoes they're wearing, to the colour of their shirt, to every freckle on their face. You don't need to over-describe a character. So over-describing is quite amateur. It's a mistake that so many wannabe writers make. So I don't want you to over-describe, but I also don't want you to tell, but I want you to practice your ability to describe subtly. It's key. Now, another mistake that amateur writers make is adverbs and adjectives. They overuse these, okay? So, for example, if you are writing something, and I see this quite often in amateur manuscripts, he ran quickly out of the room. Now, there's a word in that sentence that's not needed, and that's the adverb quickly. So, what you could do, rather than write he ran quickly out of the room, why not write he raced out of the room? Or he sprinted out of the room? So get rid of those adverbs. Adverbs are crutch tells. They're something that a writer uses to try and explain to the reader. But you can do it in a much more subtle way and a much more effective way. Don't write he ran quickly out of the room, write he raced out of the room. And then people use adjectives too often too. It's not just adverbs. So there's so many pointless or redundant adjectives used often, where somebody might even write, I've seen this in manuscript before, the blue sky. There's no need to use the word blue there. We all understand what colour the sky is. You don't have to be, talk down to your reader in that way. Plus, you don't need to describe the colour of the sky because, as I said, we already know it. So get rid of adverbs and adjectives as much as you can. Now, you're not going to write a manuscript without adverbs and adjectives, but I just want you to be conscious that so many amateur writers overuse them. Don't overuse your adverbs or your adjectives, and I promise you, you'll find your writing improving straight away. Another mistake that people make on a regular basis when they're setting out to write their first manuscript, they're flawed when they create a likable character. Now, when you're deciding on your protagonist, and by protagonist I mean the hero of your story or the main character that you want your readers to relate to or to understand, people think, I want to make my character likable so they relate to the reader. But so many amateur writers make their character likable in the wrong way because they make her pretty or him handsome or her have all these possessions that, you know, a reader would like to have, or him have, you know, the fast cars and all the girls and all these things that we think men would like. But that's flawed. You're not making that character likable, you're making that character unlikable. A likable character isn't a perfect character, so don't get that confused. A likable character is somebody your readers can relate to because they're flawed in some way, or they have, you know, some blemishes that we can all relate to. So don't fall into this trap of painting your hero cop, if you're writing crime thrillers, for example, of being this, you know, real handsome, chiseled guy with, you know, the perfect black hair, the tall, dark and handsome guy. Or don't make your female lead, you know, overly attractive and perfect in any way, because that's not creating a likable character. If you want to create likable characters, make them flawed, make them much more relatable. Now, another mistake that amateur writers make is they get their tenses mixed up. Trust me, I've seen this, I would say hundreds, probably even thousands of times through students' works that I've seen over the many years I've been teaching. Quite simply, they get their tenses mixed up. You pick a tense and you stick with it when you're writing your manuscript. So I've seen so many times where somebody begins their manuscript or begins their novel in past tense, and then suddenly present tense sneaks its way in there and they get muddled, and then the reader obviously gets muddled. I get muddled marking the particular essay or the manuscript. So when you have decided what narrative style you're going to take, which is, and I'll probably go into this a bit later, whether it's third person or first person or omniscient storytelling, you must decide what tense you're going to tell your story in. Does my story suit being told in past tense, or would I get more out of it if I told it in present tense? So once you've decided what tense best suits your story, you need to stick with that and be conscious of it at all times. So don't mix up your tenses, stick with one tense throughout your narrative style, and, you know, your story will begin to come alive. Now, another mistake amateur writers make is they overuse dialogue tags. I see this all the time, and it is a real, you know, highlight of an amateur manuscript when you see an overuse of dialogue tags. So people say you shouldn't use said because it's very boring as a dialogue tag. Trust me, use said more often than you use anything else, because people try to overwrite by using dialogue tags such as exclaimed or mumbled or spat out. And, you know, it's not good writing, because what you're doing there is you're crutch telling your reader. You're telling your reader how your character said something. But you need to be cleverer than that. You need to get across how your character is feeling through your subtle descriptive writing that we spoke about earlier, not through the dialogue tag. Because said is actually an invisible word in a way, which is a good thing, because readers just brush by it. But if you have exclaimed or mumbled or any of these overused verbs, you're just sort of telling your reader how they should feel, and that's amateur writing. It's not great writing. So don't overuse dialogue tags. Keep them subtle. Keep it as said. Another mistake that amateur writers make on a regular basis is they switch narrative styles. Now, this is a really basic error that needs cleaning up. Now, if you haven't been to a creative writing workshop, or you haven't been to university to learn about creative writing, then you're probably not overly familiar what narrative styles are. Well, you know, there's quite a few, and they can be muddled, and, you know, in contemporary fiction writing, people use different narrative styles to tell the same story. Now, we don't need to get that complicated. Let's make it simple straight away. There are three key narrative styles. First person, where you use I to tell the story, so you, as the writer of the story, are the main character. Or two, third person, so you're using he or she or they, and you're, as the narrator or as the author, you're narrating the story on behalf of other characters. Or three, omniscient, omniscient means all-knowing. So you, as the author, are all-knowing. You know everything that has happened, that is happening, and that will happen. You are all-knowing. So you need to decide what narrative style suits your story best. But once you pick your narrative style, you need to stick with it and keep it consistent through your whole story. So many times I see amateur manuscripts written in third person, and they're consistently written in third person until they jolt me out as a reader, because suddenly it becomes omniscient through rhetorical questions or through different bad habits that lead it from third person into omniscient. If you don't really know what narrative styles are, I am doing a video on that, so tune into that one to nail down exactly what the different narrative styles are. But one mistake that amateur writers make is they muddle up their narrative approaches, and that's not good writing. Now another mistake that people make on a regular basis when they're setting out to write their first manuscript is they think they've done when they finish their first draft. When you have written the end, after you've written your first draft, you are probably halfway there, or not even, maybe 40-45% of the way there. Draft number 2 and draft number 3 are key, and they will take you just as much time as draft number 1 did. Now, when you finish your 80,000 words, as an example, for the first time, and you think you're done, and you think, you know what, I'm going to send this off to publishers or agents to see if I can, attract some representation or get a publishing deal, that's not going to happen for you. Trust me. You are not done when you're finished the first draft. All you've done is relayed your story for the first time. You've got it done. You've written the end, but there's so much work still to be done. Too many people, too many amateur writers, they get excited when they're finished the first draft, but I want you to take a breath, step away from your story for a few days, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, and then come back to it and begin the redrafting process. Now, I am going to do further videos on the redrafting process. My tips are: draft number 1, get your story down. Get your story down. Draft number 2, start to improve that story. Get rid of a lot of bad habits that I talk about. Get rid of adverbs and adjectives that are overwritten. Get rid of some dialogue tags that you don't need. Get rid of the telling that you don't need. Get rid of the over description that you don't need. Draft number 3 then, for me, and it's a tip that I hand down, is you start to write voices then. Make each of your characters have a distinct voice, whether that's through dialogue or through first person narration. So there's different drafts for different processes of the writing, but you are not finished after draft number 1. So don't think that you are. So this has been 10 writing mistakes that first time writers make. I want you to not make these mistakes anymore. Write these down and then be conscious of them as you are going through your writing process. Thanks for logging in to watch this video. I really appreciate it. Do comment below. Also subscribe so you can get access to these videos on a regular basis. They will come to you as I put them out there. And if you wish, join the Facebook group Future Authors Society, where I discuss with amateur writers how they can begin the process of their book, and I support them through that. And these videos are also posted up there too. So thanks for joining, and thanks for clicking in. I'll see you around.